The key wouldn't turn. I stood there on the porch of my childhood home, my hands still weak from 3 weeks in the hospital, staring at the brass lock that had been my father's pride. The same lock I'd turned 1,000 times, coming home from school, from dates, from late nights when I thought the whole world belonged to me. Now it rejected me like a foreign object. My name is Veronica Anthony, and that morning I learned that blood means nothing when money is on the table. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comment below, and if you enjoy revenge stories, hit that subscribe button for more stories like mine. Thank you and enjoy listening. The hospital bracelet still clung to my wrist, a plastic reminder of the pneumonia that had nearly killed me. 28 years old, and I'd almost died alone in a sterile room while machines beeped my life away in measured intervals. The fever had lasted for days, my lungs filling with fluid until each breath felt like drowning. When I finally woke up, really woke up, the doctors said I was lucky to be alive. I didn't feel lucky standing on that porch. "Can I help you?" The voice came from behind me. I turned to see Mrs. Patterson from next door, her gray hair pinned back in the same style she'd worn for 20 years. Her eyes held a mixture of surprise and something else, pity maybe, or guilt. "Mrs. Patterson, it's me. Veronica. I can't seem to get my key to work." Her face crumpled like old paper. "Oh, honey. You don't know, do you?" The world tilted. "Know what?" "Your family, they moved out 2 weeks ago. Sold the house to a nice young couple from Portland." "I'm so sorry, dear. I thought you knew." The words hit me like physical blows. Sold. Moved out. 2 weeks ago, while I was fighting for my life in intensive care, while nurses were checking my pulse every hour and doctors were discussing whether my lungs would ever fully recover. "That's impossible," I whispered. "This is my house too. My father left it to all of us." Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Veronica. Your mother said, she said you'd sign papers. That you'd agreed to sell." I'd signed nothing. I'd been unconscious for most of those 2 weeks, and when I wasn't unconscious, I was delirious with fever. The only papers I'd signed were medical consent forms, and even those were shaky scrawls that barely looked like my name. My phone buzzed. A text from my brother James. "Heard you got out. Mom wants to talk. Meet us at Denny's on 5th. Not welcome home. Not are you okay? Not even we're sorry you nearly died. Just a summons to a public place like I was some stranger they were conducting business with." I drove to Denny's in the rental car I'd picked up from the hospital, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The parking lot felt like a battlefield as I walked across the asphalt, each step echoing with the weight of what I was about to face. They were already there, Mom, James, and my younger brother Caleb, sitting in a corner booth like conspirators, their faces wearing expressions I'd never seen before. Guilt mixed with defiance, shame wrapped in justification. "Veronica." Mom stood up awkwardly, her arms half raised as if she might hug me, then thought better of it. "You look better." "Better than what?" "Better than dead." James shifted in his seat. He was 2 years older than me, had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. Now he looked like a man who'd been caught stealing from a church collection plate. "Sit down, sis. We need to talk." I remained standing. "Talk about what?" "About how you sold my father's house while I was dying in a hospital bed. About how you changed the locks and didn't even tell me." "You weren't dying," Caleb said quietly. He was the baby, 25 and still living like he was 18. "The doctors said you were stable." "Stable?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was on a ventilator for 4 days. My temperature hit 104. I was hallucinating, seeing Dad standing at the foot of my bed, telling me to fight. But I was stable, so that made it okay." Mom finally spoke, her voice small and defensive. "We needed the money, Veronica. The medical bills, the mortgage payments we'd been covering since your father died. We couldn't wait anymore." "Couldn't wait for what? For me to get better? For me to have a say in selling the house my father built with his own hands?" "Your father's been dead for 2 years, James said, his voice getting harder. "We've been carrying this place ever since. You moved out, got your own apartment, acted like you didn't care about the family anymore. The accusation hit me like a slap. It was true that I'd moved out after Dad died. The house had felt too empty, too full of ghosts. Every room reminded me of him, his workshop in the basement where he taught me to use power tools, the kid Anthony where he made Sunday morning pancakes, the living room where we watched old westerns together. I couldn't breathe in that house after he was gone, but that didn't mean I'd abandoned it. Or them. I sent money every month, I said. Even when I was barely making ends meet, I sent money to help with the mortgage. $300, Caleb scoffed. The mortgage was $1,800. We were bleeding money. So you decided to sell without telling me. While I was unconscious. You forged my signature, didn't you? The silence that followed was answer enough. Jesus Christ, I whispered. You actually forged my signature. It wasn't forgery, Mom said quickly. You talked about selling before. We knew you'd agree eventually. I talked about it as a possibility. Someday. When we were all ready. Not while I was in the ICU wondering if I'd ever breathe normally again. James leaned forward, his face flushing red. You want to know the truth, Veronica? We didn't think you'd make it. The doctors said it was touch and go for a while. We needed to act fast, and we couldn't wait for you to maybe get better. The words hung in the air like poison gas. My own brother had just admitted that they'd written me off for dead and decided to cash in on my presumed demise. Get out, I said quietly. Veronica, get out. I screamed, loud enough that the entire restaurant turned to stare. Get out before I do something we'll all regret. They left, Mom crying, Caleb looking ashamed, James still defiant. I sat alone in that booth for 2 hours, drinking coffee that tasted like ash and staring at the Formica table while my world rearranged itself around this new reality. My family had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. They'd stolen my inheritance, my birthright, my connection to the man who'd raised me. And they'd done it while I was fighting for my life. But they'd made one crucial mistake. 3 months before he died, my father had called me into his workshop. He'd been getting sicker, the cancer eating away at him day by day, but his mind was still sharp. He'd made me sit on his old wooden stool while he leaned against his workbench, surrounded by the tools that had been his constant companions. Veronica, he'd said, his voice already growing thin, I need to tell you something important about the will. I'd tried to protest, to tell him he didn't need to worry about such things, that he was going to get better. We both knew I was lying. Listen to me, he'd said firmly. The lawyer's copy of the will, it's not complete. There's something your mother and brothers don't know about. He'd explained it all then, his voice growing quieter as he spoke. The house wasn't just left to all 4 of us equally, as the main will stated. There was a codicil, a separate document that gave me additional rights. Dad had been worried about what would happen after he was gone, worried that Mom might be influenced by James's gambling debts or Caleb's lack of direction. You're the strongest one, Veronica, he'd said. You're the one who'll preserve what I've built. The codicil gave me the right to block any sale of the house for 5 years after his death, unless all heirs agreed in writing with proper witnesses. It was his insurance policy, his way of making sure the family home wouldn't be lost to creditors or bad decisions. And I had proof. My phone had been recording the entire conversation. I'd been trying to capture some of Dad's stories for posterity, and I'd forgotten to turn off the recorder when he started talking about the will. His voice was there in digital memory, explaining the codicil, describing where the documents were hidden, making it clear that any sale without my explicit consent would be invalid. The lawyer who'd handled Dad's estate had died of a heart attack 6 months later. His replacement was young, inexperienced, and had apparently missed the significance of the codicil when he'd reviewed the files. Or maybe James and Mom had simply chosen not to mention it when they'd approached him about the sale. Either way, they'd committed fraud. And I had the evidence to prove it. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the one I might lose now that I'd been out of work for a month, and listened to my father's voice again. The recording quality wasn't perfect, but every word was clear. His instructions about where to find the codicil, hidden behind a false panel in his workshop, his explanation of why he'd created it, his trust in me to do the right thing when the time came. "Promise me, Veronica," his voice said through the phone's tiny speaker. "Promise me you'll fight for what's ours. This house has been in our family for 4 generations. Your great-grandfather built it with his own hands when he came over from China. Don't let it slip away because of weakness or greed." I'd promised him that day, tears streaming down my face as I watched cancer steal my father piece by piece. Now I was going to keep that promise. But first, I needed the codicil. The new owners were a young couple named the Hendersons. According to Mrs. Patterson, they were teachers who'd moved from Portland for jobs at the local elementary school. Nice people, she'd said. They'd been understanding when she'd explained about the garden gnomes she'd accidentally left in their backyard. I drove past the house 3 times over the next 2 days, studying the patterns. The Hendersons left for work at 7:30 a.m. and returned around 4 p.m. They walked their golden retriever every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, a 20-minute loop around the neighborhood that I could time to the minute. Breaking into my childhood home felt like a desecration, but it had to be done. Dad's workshop was in the basement, and if the new owners were like most people, they probably hadn't done much exploring down there yet. The codicil would still be in its hiding place behind the false panel Dad had installed himself. On Thursday evening, I watched the Hendersons leave for their dog walk. I'd parked 3 blocks away and approached through the backyard, using the key Dad had hidden under the loose brick by the back steps, assuming no one had found it yet. The key was still there. The back door opened easily, and I slipped inside like a ghost returning to haunt her former life. The house smelled different, pine cleaning solution instead of Mom's vanilla candles, fresh paint instead of Dad's pipe tobacco. The furniture was all wrong, modern and clean where our old pieces had been worn and comfortable. But the basement was unchanged. The Hendersons had simply closed the door and ignored it, probably planning to deal with Dad's workshop later. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, tools hanging in precise order on pegboard walls, half-finished projects gathering dust on the workbench, the faint smell of sawdust and machine oil that had always meant safety to me. The false panel was behind his table saw, exactly where he'd said it would be. My fingers found the hidden latch on the 3rd try, and the panel swung open to reveal a small cavity lined with plastic. Inside was a manila envelope containing 3 documents: the codicil, a letter explaining his reasoning, and a copy of the recording I'd made that day. He'd known. Somehow Dad had known I'd recorded our conversation, and he'd made his own copy as backup. The letter was addressed to me in his careful handwriting. "Veronica, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong with the family, and you've had to come looking for these papers. I'm sorry. I'd hoped that your mother and brothers would honor my wishes and work together to preserve what we've built. The codicil gives you the power to stop any sale of the house, but more than that, it gives you the moral authority to fight for what's right. This house isn't just property. It's our history, our anchor, our legacy. Don't let it be sold to pay for mistakes or weaknesses. But Veronica, I also need you to remember that family is more important than property. When you use these documents, and I believe you will have to remember that the goal isn't revenge. It's preservation. Do what you must do, but don't let anger consume you the way it consumed your grandfather when his brothers tried to cheat him out of his share of the family business. I love you. I trust you. Make me proud. Dad." I sat on his old stool and cried for 20 minutes, surrounded by the tools and projects that had been his passion. When I was finished crying, I was someone different than the woman who'd entered that basement. I was my father's daughter, armed with his wisdom and his weapons, ready to fight for what was mine. The legal battle took 6 weeks. I'd hired Patricia Valdez, the best real estate attorney in the state, using money I'd borrowed against my car and maxed out credit cards. Patricia was a small, fierce woman in her 50s who'd built her reputation destroying people who thought they could commit real estate fraud without consequences. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases I've ever seen," she told me after reviewing the documents. "Your family didn't just commit fraud, they committed stupid fraud. The codicil is ironclad, the recording is admissible, and the forged signature on the sale documents is obvious once you know what to look for. The first shot across the bow was a cease and desist letter to the title company, followed immediately by a lawsuit to void the sale. Within 48 hours, the Hendersons' attorney was calling Patricia to discuss options. The buyers want out, Patricia told me over lunch at her favorite Italian place. They're sweet people who got caught in the middle of your family's dysfunction. They'll agree to void the sale if we can guarantee they'll get their down payment back plus moving expenses. And my family? Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. Your family is about to learn that fraud has consequences. James called me that evening, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. You can't do this, Veronica. We're family. Family. I let the word hang in the air. Is that what you call selling someone's inheritance while they're unconscious in the hospital? We needed the money. Mom's got medical bills too, you know. Her diabetes medication costs $800 a month. So you decided to steal from me to pay for it. It wasn't stealing. We were going to give you your share. After you'd already spent it. After you'd made the decision without me. After you'd forged my signature and lied to lawyers and real estate agents. My voice was getting louder, but I didn't care. You wrote me off for dead, James. Your own sister. You couldn't even wait to see if I'd survive before you started dividing up my belongings. The doctors said I might not make it. Might. But you didn't care about might, did you? You saw an opportunity and you took it. There was a long pause. When James spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the guilty defensiveness, replaced by something colder. You want to play hardball, little sister? Fine. But remember, when this is over, you won't have a family anymore. Is that house really worth losing all of us? The threat should have hurt. 3 months ago, it would have devastated me. But I'd been alone in that hospital bed for weeks, fighting for every breath while my own blood relatives plotted to steal from me. I'd already lost my family. I was just making it official. You made that choice when you changed the locks, I said and hung up. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed. Patricia had filed for an emergency injunction to stop the sale, and the judge, a stern woman in her 60s who'd seen every kind of family betrayal imaginable, granted it immediately after reviewing the evidence. This is egregious, Judge Martinez said from the bench, staring down at my mother and brothers with obvious disgust. I've seen siblings fight over inheritance before, but forging signatures while a family member is hospitalized? That's a new low, even for my courtroom. The criminal charges came next. Patricia had recommended a prosecutor friend of hers, a man named James Wright who specialized in financial crimes. Wright took one look at the case and filed charges of fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse, the last because they'd exploited Mom's grief and confusion to get her to go along with their scheme. Your brothers are looking at serious time, Wright told me during our first meeting. 3 to 5 years each, possibly more depending on the financial damages. Your mother might get probation if she cooperates and testifies against them. I should have felt satisfied. Justice was being served. The law was working exactly as it should. My family had committed crimes, and they were going to pay for them. But late at night, alone in my apartment, I felt only emptiness. The house was saved, the sale had been voided, and the new owners had been compensated for their troubles. I had clear title to my father's property, along with the legal bills to prove it. But what was I supposed to do with a house that held nothing but ghosts and bitter memories? The answer came to me during one of my sleepless nights, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Dad's letter. Remember that family is more important than property, he'd written. The goal isn't revenge. It's preservation. Maybe there was another way to preserve what mattered. The meeting was my idea. Patricia thought I was crazy. Wright thought I was naive, but they agreed to arrange it. We met in the conference room at Patricia's law office, neutral ground where everyone could speak freely without the weight of the courtroom hanging over us. Mom came alone. James and Caleb were represented by their public defender, a tired-looking man who'd clearly advised them to keep their mouths shut. They sat across from me like strangers, their faces carefully blank. I have a proposal, I said without preamble. I want to drop the criminal charges. Patricia shifted beside me. We discussed this, but she still didn't like it. In exchange, I continued, I want several things. First, a written apology. Not to Mia, to Dad. I want you to go to his grave and read a letter acknowledging what you did and asking for his forgiveness. James's face flushed red. That's. Second, I cut him off. I want full financial disclosure from all of you. Every debt, every asset, every source of income. I need to understand how bad things really are. And third, I said, looking directly at my mother, I want the truth. All of it. I want to know why you thought this was okay. I want to know how you justified it. And I want to know if you're sorry, or if you're just sorry you got caught. The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Mom spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We were scared, Veronica. After your father died, everything felt like it was falling apart. The bills kept coming. James lost his job. Caleb's student loans were in default. The house felt like this huge weight dragging us all down. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. When you got sick, when the doctors said it was touch and go, we panicked. We thought if something happened to you, the house would go into probate, and we'd lose it anyway. At least this way, we could pay off the debts and have something left over. So you decided to cut me out. We decided to be practical, James said, his voice hard. You'd moved out. You had your own life. We were the ones dealing with the day-to-day reality of keeping that place together. With my money, I pointed out. The $300 a month I sent religiously, even when I was eating ramen for dinner so I could afford it. Caleb finally spoke up, his voice shaking. We were going to give you your share. When you got better, we were going to split everything equally. After you'd already spent it on your debts, we would have figured something out. I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. Fear, shame, defiance, desperation, all the emotions I'd expected to see. But there was something else there too, something that made my chest tight with old pain. Love. Despite everything they'd done, despite the betrayal and the lies and the forged signatures, they were still my family. Mom still had the same worried expression she'd worn when I was 10 and had fallen off my bike. Caleb still bit his lip when he was nervous, the same habit he'd had since childhood. James still sat with his shoulders squared, ready to fight the world for the people he cared about. They'd made a terrible choice, driven by fear and desperation and pride. But they'd made it believing they were protecting what was left of our family. Here's what's going to happen, I said finally. I'm dropping the charges, but there are conditions. The house stays in my name, but it becomes our family home again. Mom, you can move back in if you want to. Your room is exactly the way you left it. Mom's eyes filled with tears. James, Caleb, you can visit, but you don't get to live there unless you're contributing equally to the mortgage and maintenance. No more free rides. Veronica, James started. I'm not finished. My voice cut through his protest like a knife. You'll both get part of your inheritance when I die, assuming I predecease you. But not before. You've proven you can't be trusted with that kind of responsibility. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the weight of what I was carrying. And one more thing. I want Dad's workshop exactly the way he left it. No one touches his tools. No one moves his projects. That space is sacred. The agreement was signed 2 hours later. The prosecutor wasn't happy about dropping the charges, but he couldn't force me to testify if I was unwilling. Patricia thought I was making a mistake, but she drew up the paperwork anyway. I moved back into the house the following week. It felt strange at first, walking through rooms that had been rearranged by strangers, sleeping in my childhood bedroom with its familiar slanted ceiling and morning sunlight. But gradually, the house began to feel like home again. Mom moved back in a month later, tentative and grateful and trying too hard to make up for what had happened. We didn't talk about the sale directly, but we found our way back to each other through small gestures, her making my favorite cookies, me fixing the leaky faucet in her bathroom that had been dripping for years. James and Caleb came for Sunday dinner every week, awkward at first but gradually relaxing as we all learned to navigate this new version of our family. They'd both found new jobs, James at a construction company, Caleb at a bookstore, and they were slowly paying down their debts. 6 months after I moved back in, I finally went down to Dad's workshop. Everything was exactly as I'd left it that night I'd retrieved the codicil. His tools hung in perfect order. His projects sat half-finished on the workbench. The smell of sawdust and machine oil still lingered in the air. I sat on his old stool and opened the letter he'd left me, reading it again in the space where he'd written it. "Remember that family is more important than property," he'd said. "The goal isn't revenge. It's preservation." I'd preserved the house, saved it from being lost to fear and bad decisions. But more than that, I'd preserved something more important: the possibility of redemption, the chance for our family to heal from the wounds we'd inflicted on each other. It wasn't perfect. There were still tensions, still moments when old resentments flared up, still nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd been a fool to trust them again. But it was something. It was a foundation we could build on. I picked up one of Dad's unfinished projects, a jewelry box he'd been making for Mom's birthday before he got too sick to work. The wood was beautiful, cherry with inlaid walnut, but the hinges had never been attached and the finish was only half applied. Maybe it was time to finish what he'd started. I found his sandpaper and got to work, smoothing the rough edges and preparing the surface for stain. As I worked, I thought about revenge and forgiveness, about justice and mercy, about the thin line between preserving something and destroying it in the name of preservation. My family had betrayed me in the worst possible way. They'd stolen from me, lied to me, written me off for dead when I needed them most. I'd had every right to destroy them the way they'd tried to destroy me. But Dad had been right. Family was more important than property, and forgiveness was more powerful than revenge. The jewelry box took me 3 weeks to finish. When it was done, it was beautiful, smooth and gleaming, with hinges that opened silently and an interior lined with soft velvet. I wrapped it carefully and left it on Mom's dresser with a note, "From Dad. Finished with love." She cried when she found it. We both did. That night, I sat on the back porch of our house. My house, our house, Dad's house, and listened to the sound of crickets in the garden he'd planted. Mom was inside watching her evening shows, probably falling asleep in her chair the way she always did. James had called earlier to tell me about a promotion at work. Caleb had texted a picture of a book he thought I'd like. We were still broken in some ways. Trust, once shattered, doesn't heal completely. It leaves scars, weak places that might crack again under pressure. But we were together, and that was enough. The house stood solid around us, for generations of family history contained within its walls. My great-grandfather's craftsmanship, my grandfather's improvements, my father's workshop, my mother's garden. And now my choice, to preserve rather than punish, to heal rather than hurt. I pulled out my phone and played the recording one more time, Dad's voice clear in the summer darkness. "Promise me, Veronica. Promise me you'll fight for what's ours." I'd kept that promise, but not in the way I'd expected. I'd fought for something more valuable than property or money or legal victories. I'd fought for the possibility of redemption, for the chance to transform betrayal into forgiveness, revenge into restoration. And I'd won. The house was safe. The family was healing. And somewhere, I hoped Dad was proud of the choice I'd made. I closed my eyes and listened to the night sounds, feeling the weight of his tools in the basement below, the warmth of Mom's presence in the Kid Anthony, the promise of tomorrow in the summer air.